All right. Hey, you guys, it's Friday. This lecture is going up a little later than I'd intended. I had another couple of lectures that I had to get up today and do as well. So, in any case, here we go. Let's continue on with higher functions and we'll revisit the prefrontal cortex. We'll talk about association areas and we'll spend some time talking about symptomology associated with lesions, particularly to the parietal lobe, which we have not discussed up until now. I'll leave the lecture objectives for you to read through on your own. Byrne-Levy is pretty good for this in chapter 10. So we'll talk about association cortex and regions that function as association cortices. Regions of the brain that are responsible for language and motor speech, of course, Wernicke's and Broca's, which you'll hopefully recall from earlier courses, and conditions, different types of aphasia that can arise from damage to either Wernicke's or Broca's. And then we'll talk about the corpus callosum and how information is shared between the two hemispheres, and some experiments in individuals who have a severed corpus callosum and some of the interesting symptomology that arises. And then we'll revisit symptoms associated with lesions to the hippocampus and frontal lobe, which we've talked about already. And the new information today will be lesions to the posterior parietal lobe. So we saw this slide last time and we highlighted the temporal lobe and the limbic lobe in the context of bilateral removal of the medial temporal lobe in patient HM. And today I'm showing it again just to highlight that there are a number of regions that function as association areas, meaning they're important for associating or cross-linking information both within and across modalities. And so that means your visual information, if you were to see a dog, linking that with your previous experience or your memories of dogs and how dogs behave, or seeing the word dog written on a piece of paper, and linking your visual memory of having seen a dog previously, and so on. So that's what's meant by within and across modalities. And then the other structure I wanted to point out or remind you about is the corpus callosum, which of course is important. White matter, axon tracts that share information between the left and the right hemisphere. So association cortex involves, or many higher functions of the brain involve interactions between different cortical areas that function as association cortex. And I gave you this example on the previous slide, linking the word dog with visual, your visual knowledge or recognition of what a dog looks like and what it, how a dog acts, right? And so on. And we talked about working memory last time. Your visual working memory involves the prefrontal cortex, which is important for motor association, and either the posterior parietal lobe, which is important for spatial, this is the what pathway, or the inferior temporal lobe, and that's the what pathway. And so you can go back a couple of lectures and remind yourself about the where and the what pathways. And within the prefrontal cortex, there are specific neurons that respond to specific types of visual stimuli. So these were experiments that were done in monkey, and researchers found that there were specific prefrontal cortex neurons within the orbitofrontal cortex specifically that responded to peanuts or to bananas or to oranges or to raisins. And so in terms of visual working memory, it seems that there are specific neurons, or columns of neurons, or networks of neurons that are responsible for groups of objects. And so to make that clearer, let's talk about experiments that have been done in humans. And these experiments would be done in individuals who have consented to different types of memory testing while they are undergoing a surgery or having a need to have cranial electrodes inserted for some other reason. And simultaneously, they can agree to undergo memory testing. And very often that involves being shown pictures of various people or objects, and then having the response of various neurons or columns of neurons recorded. And in one particular study, there were neurons that fired in response to a visual image of Steve Carell, but not to Whoopi Goldberg, another comedian, or to Bill Clinton, another older white male. So had they shown Steve Carell followed by Will Ferrell, maybe those those same neurons or group of neurons would have fired, right? Maybe there's a category for middle-aged white comedian / actors. That would be reasonable. And it seems to be the case because there were other neurons in these individuals that would fire in response to a visual image of Jennifer Aniston and Lisa Kudrow, but not other, presumably white 40-something actresses. So this doesn't mean that there's individual neurons for individual people. More likely there are neurons or columns of neurons for groups, right? So maybe there's a friends column where if an individual were shown any one of the primary actors in the show Friends, a good time to watch it if you haven't seen it, those neurons would fire. If you are a fan of Game of Thrones, maybe if you were presented an image, any one of the primary characters in Game of Thrones, the same neurons, column of neurons, network of neurons would fire. If you're a Canucks fan, maybe whether you see Elias Pettersson or Brock Besser, or choose your favorite Canuck, those same neurons would fire. Tall, pointy landmarks. If you were to see an image of the Leaning Tower of Pisa or the Eiffel Tower, the same neurons would fire. So categorization is the point, and the idea that there are columns or networks for familiar categories, and that's important for memory preservation, because if you were to lose one individual neuron, it doesn't mean you're going to lose that memory, provided there are other neurons within the same column or across the same network that are intact. Okay, so the idea of columns for groups of categories of similar related information. All right, so we can divide the cerebral cortex into different regions, and you should be able to name the major functional regions of the cerebral cortex by this point in your anatomy and physiology education, and that's perhaps 1/5. And that would be the sensory cortex and the motor cortex and the striate cortex and so on. Association areas are other areas, right? If this is 1/5, what are the other 4/5? And so at least some of that remaining 80% of the cerebral cortex is association areas. And they may be dedicated to one modality. Maybe it's just motor stimulus or visual stimulus. Or maybe it's multi or polymodal, meaning stimuli across different modalities can be integrated within some association regions. And they're responsible for more complex stimuli and the features of that stimuli. We're talking about the prefrontal cortex, so planning responses to a specific stimuli and storing information. And so one example of an association area is Wernicke's, and another is Broca's. So language involves coordination between these two modalities, right? Where Wernicke's would be your interpretation of spoken or written language, and then Broca's is your ability to respond, speech pronunciation, motor association, and otherwise. So we're using Wernicke's and Broca's as an example of integrating information across modalities. There are certainly many other regions of the brain that could be described as association cortex. So hopefully you will recall from 205 and perhaps other courses that damage to Wernicke's leads to a type of aphasia that's referred to as fluent aphasia or receptive aphasia, because the problem is with receiving the information, right? Wernicke's is responsible for the comprehension, the understanding of either spoken or written language. The problem is not with motor skills that are required to verbalize a response. So an individual is fluent, but usually nonsensical because they don't understand what is being asked of them in the first place. So the problem is with receiving the information, not with expressing a response. So either receptive or fluent aphasia would be fine to describe this condition, but I prefer receptive because then you can really remember what's happening. The problem is with receiving. An individual doesn't understand what's being asked in the first place. Whereas Broca's, damage to Broca's area, stroke or otherwise, the problem is with motor association, the production of speech or association with regions of the motor cortex that are responsible for verbalization and speech. And so that leads to expressive aphasia or non-fluent aphasia, where the problem is with expression, with verbalizing a response. An individual understands perfectly well what's been asked, but they're unable to verbalize a response. So if we were in lecture, I would show you these two videos to highlight the symptomology or the speech in an individual who has damage to Wernicke's, in this case due to a stroke, and also damage to Broca's, where you can imagine that an individual who has damage to Wernicke's is kind of blissfully unaware of what's being asked in the first place, whereas an individual who has damage to Broca's understands perfectly well, but simply can't respond, which you can imagine could be very frustrating. So I won't make this file massive by showing you these videos here, but I'll post them for you in the usual place and ask you to please watch them on your own time. The first is an individual who had a stroke and subsequent damage to Wernicke's area, and the other is an individual who also had a stroke, but it led to damage in Broca's area. Right, so in terms of language, Broca's and Wernicke's, regardless of hemispheric dominance, in other words, whether you are left hemisphere dominant and right-handed or right hemisphere dominant and left-handed, for our purposes, both of these regions, Wernicke's and Broca's, are localized to the left hemisphere, okay? And that's regardless of handedness or sensory motor dominance. Okay, so for our purposes, we can say this is all the time. For any question that I will ask you, you may assume that Broca's and Wernicke's are localized to the left hemisphere. Are there exceptions? Yes, there are. But for our purposes, language comprehension and motor speech are localized to the left hemisphere. So if you imagine in this image, the corpus callosum is severed. And so I'd like you to think about, and I won't give you the answer right here, right now, but I'd like you to think about if the corpus callosum is severed, what would happen if you asked this individual to raise their right arm? Would they be able to do it if the corpus callosum is severed, right? So that means the information would need to be received, and it would need to get to the correct motor cortex to raise, to give the right, to give the command to raise the right arm via the corticospinal pathways we talked about previously in the course. So if the corpus callosum is severed, and assuming, as we will for our purposes, that Broca's and Wernicke's are in the left hemisphere, would this individual be able to raise their right arm? in response to a verbal command to do so. And then once you've thought through that, I'd like you to think through, what about if you asked them to raise their left arm? Would they be able to do so with a severed corpus callosum and assuming that Broca's and Wernicke's are localized to the left hemisphere? Okay, this is where you need to think about ipsilateral versus contralateral control and which pathways control ipsilaterally and contralaterally. So I'll let you think about it and hopefully come up with the right answer. All right, so the next set of slides show intrahemispheric transfer. So before we get into this, I need to take a quick break and tend to a few other things. So I'm going to leave you here for now, let you think through what I just asked you to think through, and we'll pick it up with this slide. I'll try and get this up for you tonight, if not first thing in the morning, and then we'll talk about intrahemispheric transfer and training of various types. And you'll need to recall nasal versus temporal optic chiasm, where the information goes. So you can take a few minutes and revisit that, and that'll help you out for the next series of slides. We will talk about intrahemispheric transfer in the presence and absence of either a severed optic chiasm or corpus callosum. So we'll pick it up from here shortly, and I'll talk to you soon.